I wanted to talk a little bit about table saw safety. Now, this is potentially a really big subject, and it's not something I can get through in 10 or 12 minutes, but there is one aspect which I think is going to improve a lot of your processes if you're not thinking this way already. There's some table saw processes which are just inherently dangerous, and if we've worked at a table saw or watched enough YouTube videos or taken a class, those are off the table. On the other side, there are some procedures which are super safe. Using a crosscut sled, clamping a workpiece down to the sled as we're making a cut, pretty foolproof. What I want to talk about, and where I think the real danger lies, is that gray area between things we know are dangerous and things that are absolutely safe. And it's this category of things where, unless we have a true understanding of what's going on in the saw, we can have a sense that this is totally safe. And that might be true for 10 cuts, 20 cuts, 30, but when things go wrong, they can go wrong really quickly. And that means either, at the very least, you've got burn marks and table saw blade marks on the edge of a board. And to its extreme, we can do some bodily damage. And the main thing is, I don't want you to be surprised when something happens, meaning I think you need to have a realistic assessment of the risk challenge of what's going on at any step when you're at the table saw. So the primary question is this: is my workpiece trapped between the fence and the blade during this cut? If the answer is yes, then the next question is, does it have to be? And on something like a simple rip, yeah, it kind of has to be. Like a rip on the table saw using a rip fence, it's a very simple and basic process. It's also something that actually in my classes, students tend to have a lot of problems with. There's a lot of moving parts between footwork and handwork and pressure, moving the workpiece in the opposite direction that a blade is spinning. So there's a lot of things to keep in mind. The main thing is, when we have to trap a workpiece between the blade and the fence, it's all about being able to control that piece through the cut. That's where push sticks and push pads come into play. So if I am working on narrow cuts, I want to use a push stick. Now, something like this little kind of a bird's mouth thing, which comes with every table saw, throw it away. This is good for nothing. The main thing is, I want to be able to control the workpiece through the cut. So if I have this here, I can really, not a lot of good things are happening here. Here's the reason why it's particularly important and also a challenge to keep our workpiece against the fence. And that's because the opposite rotation of the blade, as we're pushing forward and we're pushing off to one side of the blade is wanting to pull that stock away from the fence. The stock coming away from the fence in any situation is going to be a bad thing. And in a trapped cut like this, it's especially bad, because when a workpiece comes away from the fence, it's coming into the blade. And if you don't have a splitter or riving knife on your saw, and that stock hits the teeth as they're coming up, exiting the surface of the plate, it's going to lift it up, spin it, and rotate it, and that's what kickback is. It's particularly a challenge on wider stock. But even for narrow stock, the idea for a true cut is I want to be able to control that stock against the fence. I used to think that anything greater than 3 inches, and I'm pretty comfortable having my hands go across the blade. I'm not that way anymore. I like to either have a push stick or a push pad for just about every action. So this is no good. What I prefer is a paddle style push stick, something with a long reference surface. This way, I can use that to apply rotational force to keep the stock against the fence as I'm making this cut. The other thing that this paddle style has is it has a little recess here, which allows me to put my hand forward of the hook, meaning as I'm making this pass, my hand is forward of the rear edge of the board, and it just gives me a lot of control over this workpiece here. Here's another paddle style, and it kind of has the same dip, but this is actually kind of the opposite of what we want because your hand is just going to slip forward. I'm not comfortable holding it up here, so this is the style I prefer. Mark Adams School of Woodworking, I stole this from them. They have these all over the place. So Mark Adams, I believe, did an article on table saw safety. If you want to look up that paddle style, super simple, just out of MDF or plywood. Make it out of something that you're not afraid to run across the blade. I don't like buying fancy push pads and paddles that I'm afraid to actually run through a blade, because then my attention is towards the place where it shouldn't be, other than making the cut. And so the last thing I want to talk about on a simple rip cut is, because I'm really focused on keeping the stock against the fence through the cut, a lot of us naturally are putting our attention and our sight right where the blade is making a cut in the stock. Where I really want to be looking, and what I recommend people do, is actually look toward the outfeed and make sure that the stock is against the fence as it's leaving. If you start to see a gap up here, bad things are going to start to happen. So on wider stock, on short wide pieces, there's even a greater tendency towards kickback because it's shorter and wider. We don't have the long length of a long strip, and without that riving knife, if the stock comes away and hits those teeth, it's going to spin like a frisbee. And a lot of people say, well, my hands are really far away from the blade. I'm never going to accidentally cut my thumb off because I know I've got a lot of distance here. Well, the problem is this, is as you're pushing this stock through and it lifts up this piece and spins it around, it pulls your hand into the blade super quick before you can even react. So most people, it's the right, whether it's the fingers or your thumb, that takes the brunt of that. So really the kickback is a huge problem there. So I like a push pad. Again, this is the kind of thing you can buy. You actually have to pay money for it, and it tends to have a small pad and it tends to be pretty slippery. I prefer getting just the rubber pad off of a grout float and either just use the float itself, or in this case, this was stuck onto a nice little handle there. And that allows me the same thing where it's a good nonstick surface. I can drive it through, I can apply rotational pressure, I can keep my hand up above the blade, so even if that comes across, I'm okay. And this is just a really safe and sound way to take care of that. So that's the situation where we can't avoid trapping the workpiece between the rip fence and the blade when we're ripping stock. A lot of other instances where we may want to do that and we are trapping the stock, there's often a better way around it. And I think that's where an understanding can really come into play. Is what I'm doing trapping the workpiece between the blade and the fence? And does it have to be? The first technique I want to talk about is just cutting a simple rabbet on the edge of a board. Really common thing. We're doing this all the time. Few ways to go about doing it. A really common way is to use a dado blade. It goes really quick. As a rule of thumb, whenever I'm cutting a rabbet, is I'm always setting up my dado blade wider than the width of the rabbet I need. So in one situation, I can just move the fence away from the blade and just rabbet this outside edge. It's pretty easy to do. It's a simple setup. One of the problems is the fact that that extra width of the dado blade is now sticking out and is exposed on the outside of that workpiece. So that's not great. I think the bigger issue is the fact that the workpiece is now trapped between the inside of the dado set and the rip fence tube. So here's another situation where, is this a trapped cut? Yes, it is. What can go wrong when the workpiece comes away from the fence? Well, again, that workpiece is going to come into that blade, which is going to give us a really scarred up and uneven rabbet. And it can also potentially come across and kick back. The dado set is a particular challenge because unlike a 10-inch blade in a saw like a saw stop that has a riving knife, a dado set does not have a riving knife. So there is nothing keeping the stock from contacting those teeth as they're coming up out of the saw, which can be a really dangerous situation. So second question, yes, this is a trap cut. Does it have to be? It doesn't. And there's a really easy workaround here. And we can either bury the blade partially in a sacrificial fence or just clamp a really simple L fence to the saw. So this is sticking up just above the blade. So I want it high enough so that it clears the blade, and I want it low enough so that the workpiece is supported against the L fence along its entire length. This is a really simple example of that. Bob Van Dyke at Connecticut Valley, he wrote an article for us on an adjustable height L fence, super cool. You'll spend a weekend making it. It's just a little less cumbersome than this, but just get two boards, glue them together, and this is going to come in handy for a lot of things. What I can do now is I can adjust the effective width of the blade by the amount that I overlap the blade with the fence. So I'm still using just a partial width of the blade, but now as I'm making this cut, is the workpiece trapped between the blade and the fence? Nope, it's not. It's cutting on this inside edge. What happens if this workpiece comes away from my guiding surface, in this case, the edge of an L fence? Well, I just end up with a shallower rabbet or no rabbet at all. And the remedy for that is to come by and just take the second pass. Okay? So we've gone from a situation where we are trapping the stock between the blade, exposing the blade, and running the risk of the stock coming away from the fence into the blade and doing a lot of bad things. So all this really stems from that understanding of, is this setup trapping the stock between the blade and the fence? If it is there a way around it? In the case of rabbets, absolutely. That also holds true for chamfers and bevels as well. So let me talk about that. One instance where you're going to possibly be chamfering the corners of a board is when we're making an octagon. I've actually seen a couple of YouTube videos made by experienced woodworkers who have gotten caught by surprise when things went wrong when cutting an octagon. And I want to talk about how they went about doing it, which again is very logical, but also apply this notion of, is the workpiece being trapped against the fence or not? Can that cause problems? So in this case, each woodworker had the blade tilted at 45 degrees away from the fence, and they were running their stock to cut their corners off. So the first couple corners where we have a lot of support on the underside is pretty safe. Not a lot can go wrong. The problem comes to where after we've already chamfered one corner and that is down and against the fence, what happens is we don't necessarily see that. It doesn't really come to mind that there's no support here. So if we have our push stick against the fence, what can happen is the workpiece can roll. And I believe this is what happened in both instances because, once again, is the workpiece trapped between the blade and the fence? Yeah. What happens if that workpiece comes away from the fence? Well, at the very least, we're going to get some scarring on that chamfer by the table saw. And what happens is if we're pushing down, and this piece rolls against the fence, it is rolling into the blade, and a significant portion of that stock is in contact with the blade. And I think I either saw the workpiece come straight back or even kind of come out. It happened so quickly, it just kind of went, it like disappeared. And one of the woodworkers even spoke to how shaken they were at this, because it was something that they didn't expect to happen. And I think that's the key here, and the key to safety is to have an understanding. Okay, so I am doing this. What are the risks? And is there a way to avoid it to begin with? And the answer is yes, there is. And we can handle that by moving the fence to the other side of the blade. So once again, the L fence comes into play and is going to make this a much safer operation. So I'm going to go ahead and have the fence on the opposite side and attach the L fence. Okay. So with the L fence in place, the blade is effectively buried in the fence. So we can still do our chamfering. It's a little bit more cumbersome because we're on the opposite side of the fence than we're accustomed to. But I think it's still something that's worth our time to get comfortable with, because what's happening now is, as we're making this cut, pretty much everything goes to plan. And when we ask ourselves a question, what happens when the workpiece comes away from the L fence? Well, in this case, nothing, because we're just not making a cut. And if that workpiece were to roll, because we're cutting this inside corner, the unsupported edge is on the outside. So if we accidentally push too hard down on the outside, it's literally going to roll away from the blade. So here's a situation where we've taken something with the column trapped between the blade and the fence when the fence was on the right. We move it to the left, bury the blade in an L fence, and we've taken a lot of risk and danger out of that situation, okay? So a similar situation to cutting the corners on an octagon is raising a panel with a shallow bevel around the outside edges. Again, it's a really, really common technique to just tilt your blade, run the workpiece between the fence and the blade, and nothing goes wrong unless the workpiece comes away from the fence. So in this situation, is this a trapped cut? Yeah, it is. And so what can happen as we're cutting this bevel and the workpiece comes away from the fence and into the blade? At the very least, we're going to have a lot of scarring and a lot of burn marks left over from the blade. And especially on this end grain of the panel, it can be just a real bear to clean up. So I'd like to keep these as clean as possible. Once again, the solution is, let's try to avoid that trap cut to begin with. And just like the octagon, I'm going to bring the fence back to the left side of the blade. With the fence on the left side of the blade, I want to go ahead and add a little bit more vertical support. This is a really simple thing. Basically, it's just a vertical fence attached with some little cleats there to a shorter piece, which I can clamp to the fence. You can avoid all this and just run that dovetail groove in the back and use those dovetail clamps. This is kind of more of an old school way to go about doing it. And I can just go ahead and clamp this to the rip fence. And I can do one of two things now, is I can lower the blade, move my fence in place, and run the bit right up into the blade. I can also just add a piece of MDF or 1/4-inch plywood onto the face above the blade to create just a little bit of a rabbet so that I can move the workpiece over and have that blade buried into the fence. So once again, I've got a situation where if I'm making this cut now, and I'm beveling that inside face, if this comes away from the fence, nothing happens. So rather than getting trapped between the blade and the fence, this is just a really easy way to go about raising a panel. So you get really clean edges. If you mess up the cut and this comes away from the fence, just hit it back and do a second run. The other thing you can do is just tap this over just incrementally after you raise it if you want to clean up that cut even more. So in the situation of ripping stock, we're stuck. We're stuck between the blade and the fence. That comes down to controlling the stock as we make the cut. However, on things like rabbets, chamfers, and raised panels, there's another solution. So start by asking yourself, am I trapped between the blade and the fence? If I am, is there another way to go about doing it? And with that, you'll have a much better understanding of the situation you're faced with. And if you are cutting with an octagon trapped between the fence and the blade, just be aware of what can happen and take a lot of care when you're doing something like that. The more you know, the easier things get, the safer they get, and the better work we end up doing. All right, good luck.